Welcome to episode 57 of the Headspace and Timing Podcast, a show brought to you by the Change Your POV Podcast Network. Today's guest is Carl LoFaro, a licensed clinical social worker and Army veteran. If it sounds like Carl and I are just two buddies having a conversation, it's because we knew each other before the Headspace and Timing Podcast and blog were even a thing. In this episode, Carl and I have a wide-ranging conversation about something that both of us are passionate about and frustrated about: veterans accessing mental health care services. We take a look at what keeps a veteran from reaching out for mental health counseling and what changes need to be made in order to help them do so.
That's maybe another thing that's really important to note is that I think I want this problem to be solved overnight. I hope all of us want this, to wake up tomorrow and never hear about another veteran completing suicide. But yeah, let's look at the change in generations. So I have a Korean War veteran who's 88 that I meet with occasionally, and he didn't start talking about these problems until, he retired very late in life, until he was in his early to mid 80s, and he was talking to family members, and they said, "Hey, we'd never heard these stories before." And then a family member knew me and said, "Hey, why don't you talk to Carl?" And that, in this message that I get from him and that he wants everybody to know is, don't wait until you're 80.
Welcome to the Change Your POV Podcast Network. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes about veteran mental health. My name's Dwayne France, and I'm a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After I retired from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set right, however, it was just a huge useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing isn't set correctly either. That's my goal with this show: to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support veterans, service members, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about: veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. How about you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and kind of who you are, where you've been, what you're doing, and where you're going.
Okay. I'm Carl LoFaro. I am currently the manager of Veteran and Military Family Services at Jefferson Center for Mental Health. We're a community mental health agency that has my program among many others. And our mission within my program is to provide mental health services for those impacted by military service, whether it's the veteran or the family member. And we're trying to be as inclusive as possible with those definitions. I just also want to mention that I don't speak for my agency, and these ideas are all my own. So a little bit of background: I served in the Army from 2005 to 2009 as a mental health specialist, 68 X-ray, which our job was kind of like a medic, where we provided support to a mental health professional, usually a social worker. And as with every job in the Army, we get to end up doing a whole lot more than we're trained for. And that's something that was really exciting. I got to do a lot of mental health services, both stateside and when I was deployed to Iraq. So I got a lot of exposure to multiple areas of the Army, and it was pretty exciting. Pretty exciting stuff, I guess, for a rather pogish MOS. When I got out in 2009, I got a job as a civilian at Fort Meade, doing, in fact, the exact same work. With the same job title, just that I could grow a beard and wear civilian clothes to work every day and call out if I didn't feel like coming to work.
So sort of like Special Forces.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I was like a Special Forces mental health guy. That's a great way of describing it. Yeah, I had the beard. I had the civilian clothes. I had the cocky attitude. Yeah, so I was like a Special Forces mental health guy.
Yeah. You could call in whenever you wanted, not show up to the team room.
Yeah, why not? And I was at Fort Meade, so a lot of mysterious things were happening. Who knows that it wasn't in our mental health clinic? Yeah, and after that, I went to social work school and kind of switched gears a little bit. And then I decided, I actually really care about veterans, and I really want to devote my life to working with them around mental health issues. So kind of came back to the fold and have been doing this job at Jefferson Center for about the past 4 years. And so that's kind of my background. And I guess, do you want me to speak about kind of maybe my personal interest or passions right now, or why I do this work?
I mean, and really just to kind of, touch on some of that, I often, tell people, I was not a mental health professional. I wasn't even in the mental health field in the military, but you were. I actually went to school with my master's program with a mental health specialist too. And so you actually had a background in the military of doing this. And so you have a lot, kind of a deeper and richer experience and more longer experience than I have. But I think the other thing that's unique is we've known each other. I think maybe with the exception of one other guest, you and I have known each other the longest, probably going on 3 or 4 years now. And we first connected with our mutual work in the Veterans Court. So you work with justice-involved veterans or have done some work with that in the past, like me too.
Yeah, I think that's, now that you mention it, it has been really about 3 years since we first connected. And I think that I was, as a non-VA employee, to be doing the veterans work in my community, for our community, it kind of was isolating because there aren't that many of us that were doing the work. And then especially not that many of us that were looking to talk about it. That there are many, honestly, there are many mental health professionals that happen to be veterans and that even focus on veterans. But I think that many of us are wanting to just put our heads down and do the clinical work and maybe not try to do the systemic change that I think both you and I are looking at as a bigger picture.
Yeah, it is a very inward focused and introspective career field. And again, you and I have had, we should have recorded all of our conversations that we've had before, but have talked about the idea that we're so convinced that our product works, and it does work. Our therapy does work, but we're so convinced in the efficacy of what we're doing that everybody will just know that, and they'll just come in and buy our product without us having to sell it. And that's not really the case.
Yeah, that we're we're veterans who provide mental health care. We know that within our community there are a lot of veterans that are impacted by these issues. So we just put up our sign, and they'll be kicking down our door trying to get in, because we want something that they need, or we offer something they need.
And that's not the reality of what happens, not even close.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing I noticed both in the, you're right, I have had a longer experience with this, and I think that I feel really grateful to have had that opportunity to serve in the military in that capacity. But I mean, really, it was just dumb luck that I got the job, but it suited me. But I mean, whether it's at Fort Stewart when my first real work ever was doing redeployment screens for a unit that had been back 90 days. And there were these folks that were these soldiers that were identified as, saying their view, saying yes to the wrong questions, that they'd been, bothered by mental health symptoms or symptoms of PTSD. So I would, they went into the special trailer and talked to me. And I think I probably did 30 or 40 screens in that week. There were probably only a small, less than a handful of people that said, yes, I want treatment. I want mental health care. Despite people talking about relationships that have fallen apart, despite people talking about drunk driving, despite people talking about just being miserable, that only maybe 2 or 3 out of the 40 or 30 or 40 wanted anything to do with mental health services on their own. And unfortunately, when we later in that 6 months leading up to my deployment, I encountered at least one of these guys who was being processed out of the Army for substance abuse. So I guess his story was that he had problems coming back from deployment. He chose not to get mental health care, and then turned to cocaine, and then was getting kicked out of the Army, and basically his service was worth nothing. And I saw this time and time again when I was in the service, was that people would say, no, I got back from deployment or whatever their issue, not necessarily even deployment related, but I'm okay. I'm not okay. I guess I'm okay enough to not get help. And then there would be something else. There would be some kind of behavioral problem. And this is, again, I really want to emphasize, this is not saying that mental illness is an excuse for misconduct, poor behavior, drunk driving, or anything like that, but that they didn't know how to cope, and people reach a breaking point, and then they do something that that has long-term impact. And it's just like if they had gotten mental health care, if they had been, I guess, maybe strong enough to say, "Hey, I need help," their lives would be very different right now.
And that's exactly it. And I think that's what I first saw in justice-involved veterans, where they didn't have a choice, right? I mean, the guys in the veterans courts, especially the one that I'm working in, and we're all similar here in Colorado in that respect, where the judge says, the choice of whether or not you will access this treatment is out of your hands. You will go and you will talk to them. And then when they actually got into the treatment, they were like, "Oh, this stuff actually works," But one of the first barriers is the first, no, I don't think I need it, and this is going to pass on its own.
Yeah, and that's really, I think, crucial, is that there's something that's scaring these folks from coming into our office or coming in, to meet with a therapist. They think, and honestly, like, that's me too. So, I've worked in the mental health field for going on 13 years. And I, really until only a couple of years ago, thought that there was something really wrong with me, that I needed to see a therapist, that I'm, as a mental health professional, I should have it under control. And if I can't have it under control, there's something really wrong with me. And the thing is, like, me, as somebody who is working in this field, exposed to the benefits of it all the time, I still have those attitudes, let alone somebody who's, platoon sergeant is saying, the only people that go to mental health are the ones that we're kicking out of the Army, implicitly implying or explicitly saying, no one else is going. My soldiers don't have problems. But but you're right. Like, once a soldier or Marine or a veteran gets in, however they got in, they usually are like, "Hey, this isn't so bad, and this is helpful." And so that's kind of why I think I've kind of switched my interest from the delivering clinical care to, like, that whole other part of the iceberg. It's that for every veteran that we see, how many would you estimate are out there suffering without the help that they need?
Now, I mean, and that's huge. I actually, on one of the previous episodes, I had the chair of a study that was released at the end of January. There's back on episode 45.
The National Science Engineer, whatever, medical people. That huge study. Cool.
Yep. Yeah. And so on that, and that was one of their primary findings. Listeners can go back to episode 45 and listen to this, but 50%. So they did all of these screens, right? So they screened everybody, all of the veterans that they asked. They gave them the standard screening. Over 50% of the veterans that showed positive for mental health needs, depression, anxiety, PTSD, I think there was like 53% didn't even realize they had a problem. They didn't perceive a need, that there was an issue. And of the 50% or less than 50% who did perceive a need, only 25% of them actually access care. And so 75% of the veterans, and that goes back to your iceberg thing, 75% of the veterans who screen positive for a potential mental health condition either didn't know they needed care or refused access to care.
Yeah, and so I think this is a great plug for your podcast. So this article is something between 300 and 400 pages. I wish I had just paid more attention to your podcast, because I would have saved myself some time. But yeah, that was one of the things actually.
You read the whole
I didn't
thing?
read the whole thing. I kept skimming through it.
I see.
It was.
I couldn't get through the whole thing either, but
man, it was.
But there was a lot of great stuff in there.
Powerful message that there are the first takeaway is that there are people who don't realize that their suffering is due to something not internal, like that or that it's not their fault, even maybe a way to say it, that there's something that happened to them, and implicit to that is that there's something that can be fixed. They're just suffering because without awareness, of the cause. And then also those who say, yeah, I know there's something wrong, but I don't want help is a whole nother matter.
Yeah, and that, as you said, that's what we're trying to do here. And again, you and I, very specifically in our own areas, are trying to raise awareness about, hey, this is actually something that works, and it works as good, sometimes better than medications. It works great in conjunction with medications. It definitely works better than the bottom of a fifth of Jack.
Yeah.
I mean, but for you and I guess again independently, have been trying to bang this gong, and we're trying to sell a product that veterans know they need but don't want to be seen buying.
Yeah, I think about, and maybe this hopefully doesn't get me in trouble at work, but yeah, it's like we're the dirty, we're like the guys in the pharmacy, like we're the hemorrhoid cream, or we're the prophylaxis.
No, that is exactly and I was waiting to see what you came up with, because that's exactly what I came up with, is we're trying to sell Preparation H. That's exactly, nobody wants to be caught buying it. Nobody wants to talk about why they need it. They don't want to talk about what they do with it, but it works pretty well for the problem that you buy it
for. And the thing is, you're not going to tell your friends generally, even when they're complaining about the same problem. Which is actually I guess I wanted to touch on one cool thing that was really successful that happened recently on my team. I'm not going to take credit for it because it was all my clinician that did it. But she had a client that I think that ended up just getting connected with us. He was a veteran for something completely unrelated in his mind, than the military. Like the military didn't cause his problem in his mind. Mm-hmm. Got him connected with my therapist, and within, I would say, 6 months, 7 months, he told one of his buddies who's a veteran that he worked with, hey, I'm going to see this therapist. She's pretty cool. Give it a shot. The buddy comes in. A couple months after that, another referral from this same guy. And my therapist my clinician reports, hey, like this guy is telling his friends that not only that he's getting mental health care, but it helps. And I think maybe that last part of the message is that, hey, it works, is what's pulling people in.
And I absolutely agree. The message of the message goes both ways. A veteran that has a bad experience with a mental health professional is going to go tell his buddies, don't even bother. And they're not saying this clinician wasn't a good clinician. Yeah. They're saying that this doesn't work. It's a bunch of crap. You don't need it. It didn't work for me. It's not going to work for you. Whereas if we get the word out and we explain that, hey, it does kind of work and it is all right, that veterans, this is a common theme that keeps coming up, especially among veterans who come on the show, but the clinicians who come on the show see the same thing, that it has to do with veterans need permission before they access mental health care. Not permission as in I will allow you to do it, but permission to say it's okay for you to. Going back to your platoon sergeant there, how much different would it have been if the platoon sergeant says, yeah, you know what? I did it, and it worked for me, and it saved my marriage, and it'll work for you. I will allow you to go in, and I'm not going to kick you out for it.
Yeah, I mean, it would have actually. I can provide examples of platoon sergeants giving that exact same message. So I guess I don't know what the deal is with intelligence, but they seem to be intelligent, at least as far as how they address mental health needs. When we were in Iraq, we had an intelligence company, that was part of our combat brigade, that we saw a lot of their not just their soldiers, their NCOs, their officers. And the reason why is because the first sergeant said, hey, you guys this is hard work. I'm seeing a counselor. You guys should go too. He says, I need you to be sleeping. I need you to not be distracted by at that point, MySpace nonsense. I need you to get along with your coworkers, and we've got a resource for that. And he said, not only did he give them permission, because these were folks who were, in these blacked out window rooms, 12 hours at a time, but he would give them time to go to mental health appointments. and he would bring them himself, and he even brought one of his platoon sergeants. And I mean, it was cool. And I think that one thing that we saw from that unit is not a single soldier had to be, evac'd early or had to redeploy early. And again, these were all very highly trained soldiers that had a very special skill. And basically their first sergeant gave them permission. He said, no, like if you have this issue, you're going to take care of it because I'm taking care of it. And then my work at Fort Meade, I saw similar things where Fort Meade is where the NSA is where people who work at the White House and Pentagon get mental health treatment. And we were seeing folks that, who were very much afraid that the career was going to get impacted by like the mental health question on the SF-86. But they would often be brought in, hey, my master sergeant in the Air Force told me to come down here. He said, hey, you need to get help for this. And there's a resource. And then also allow them the time. So it is cool. There is a very big difference between the unit that has the positive, kind of internal salesman for mental health than the unit that does not.
And I think that's where, and it goes back to the gaps. And there's gaps, of course, we talk about the civilian-military divide, but there's gaps, especially when it comes to veteran mental health, between mental health providers and the clients that we're trying to serve, the veterans that we're trying to help. And that's where, again, where you said you're shifting away from direct providing service to getting the word out and kind of stepping into that gap and letting other veterans know, hey, this stuff, it actually works. And it works well, and it works quickly. But if you don't put preparation H on it, it's never going to heal, and you're just going to be uncomfortable for a very, very long time.
Yeah, and no one wants to be the guy chaptered out of the Army for hemorrhoids, Like, that's when it could have been prevented. And that those gaps are there. And we as mental health professionals who both happen to be veterans, maybe we feel like that we hope that we can reach everybody, kind of like we've got this message and we need to tell people about it. But really, like, for every veteran that listens to your podcast or every veteran that I encounter at like a street fair or something, there's going to be however many 100 who don't hear from us directly. And that's why we need other veterans to fill this gap.
But I think that there's even barriers there, Carl. I mean, and just where getting veterans or even community members to be interested, and again, everybody thinks they know it's PTSD, it's TBI, and we're I don't know, rolling. It's like Sisyphus, right? We're trying to trudge this great big ball up a hill, and then it keeps running down. How do we counteract against
One thing that we've got working against us as veterans, or our community that we're trying to serve, is that we are all tough, we're all awesome, we've all done something great, and that we're stubborn because, when we were deployed or even in garrison, like, we're not going to, every time that we take a knee and take care of ourselves, somebody else is having to pick up the slack. That, if you're going to the dentist to get that tooth pulled, somebody else is in the motor pool PMCSing your vehicle. And that's such short-term thinking, because what happens when your tooth becomes abscessed and you have to miss work for 3 weeks when it could have been an hour appointment much earlier?
So that's an interesting concept. But wasn't that the way things were in the military? It was all, 50 and 100 meter targets, and we'll worry about the 300 meter target when it becomes the 100 meter target. Like, so is it part of the military mindset that, we'll just avoid the problem until it becomes the problem and we'll deal with it then?
Yeah, it's like we'll patch it up and keep going because we don't have enough time and we don't have enough resources. And that 300 meter target's not going to stab you with a pitchfork until they get close to 50 meters, and then you just take care of it. I think about, like, the one thing that is interesting is that the military cares about safety. And I feel like that we PMCS our vehicles, we replace parts, we overhaul airplane engines after they've had, so much time, whether there's something wrong with it or not. But that when it comes to our soldiers, we don't do that.
No, that's exactly right. It's one of the blog posts I think I've written before about some of the reasons to go see a mental health professional. It has nothing to do with PTSD. And one of the reasons is we PMCS'd our equipment. We conducted preventive maintenance on our equipment. We were in the military. We can provide preventive maintenance on our minds and our bodies and our souls, right? And we can get things taken care of. And I think it's, and in that blog post, I'll make sure it's linked in the show notes, but we talk about Mental Health America, their idea of before stage 4. If it's cancer, if it's diabetes, if it's, certain, these physical ailments, they want to catch it at stage 1. You don't want to get it to stage 4 because then it's too late. And so people will go access, healthcare before, at the very slightest indication. But with mental health, we wait until stage 4, until something happens, and then finally we come in. The veterans come into you and I, we're like the psychological emergency room. They're bleeding from 1,000 places, and now it's, hey doc, patch me back up. Whereas if we would have gotten in early, we wouldn't have gone to an emergency situation.
Yeah, and then also just the cost of all of those things that they've lost along the way. The justice-involved veteran who's had a mental health challenge since 2003, but it wasn't until that he or she was forced to get the help that they actually got it. I guess maybe to bring it back to like the gaps, like, I don't know, what do you see as a gap that can be targeted?
Well, and this is some of the challenge, I think, is the awareness gap. That's the problem that we need to solve is not veteran suicide. It's not veteran homelessness. It's not veteran unemployment. The true source of the problem, I believe, is the lack of awareness, A, that there's something to address, and B, that there's something that's beneficial to addressing that. So that, I think, is the bottom line overall thing. And everybody's trying to solve the other problems without addressing the root cause. And so really we're talking about root cause analysis of veteran suicide, homelessness, justice involvement, all of these indicators. The root cause is untreated and undiagnosed mental health conditions. And that's really, again, what you're trying to do with your advocacy piece and getting out in your community, and what I'm trying to do online with the podcast and the blog. And then once we do, and this is my fear, or maybe my hope first and then my fear, is that once we do raise awareness, veterans are going to come knocking on a door, getting ready to get help, and then that leads to other barriers that exist to care.
Yeah, that if we're proposing this problem, shouting it from the rafters, and there's got to be somebody ready there to deliver the help that they need. And I think that's why it's so important what we're doing out in the community is that, this is a community issue. The community benefits from the healthy veteran and pays the burden of the unhealthy veteran. That we can, we all have heard the message that something's wrong with the VA. And I honestly happen to be getting excellent mental health care from the VA, and I'm very happy with it. But that's not an answer for everybody. And it's not just, I think it's not just you go to the VA for mental health care or you get nothing. Because that misses out on a lot of veterans, often the ones that are most in need. And also, let's give people some preferences. Let's give people choices. People want choices. And I think that's where we as a community need to be ready to step in. Is not say, hey, wait, hey, veteran, when you're ready to come around and try our idea, the VA is right there. But rather, hey, veteran, what are your need is right now. How can we address it? It can be very helpful.
But there's a lot of barriers, barriers to access, and that's something that you said that you're really now trying to look into. But there are, once we do get the veterans to say, okay, yes, got it, big bald guy, I've got a problem and I want help, but now I reach out. What barriers are there that a veteran can run into?
I think a big one is just the kind of the language. Like the veteran doesn't know what to ask for. I think, or even communicate it. That for many veterans, like these mental health challenges are a huge source of shame, especially if they feel like they're not fulfilling their role, as a husband or a mother or what employee, that they don't know how to quite describe what's going on. And they may, because they don't know the language or they don't know what the issue is, they may not be able to get connected to the right person, in a timely manner. And so I think that it's important to educate veterans like, hey, this is, these are mental health challenges or mental illness, that when you feel like, when you think about being tired all the time and not the right thing, like that you read about in Men's Health, or maybe it's depression, let's give you some vocabulary, and let's give you the questions to ask.
Does that come down to, we should call it something other than veteran mental health? Because I'll tell you how I feel about it, or, a rose by any other name. But you saw it when you were in the military, changed it from mental health to behavioral health, and it had the same stigma. It's not the language we use, it's the attitudes towards the product, I guess.
Yeah, and even while we were deployed, we called it combat stress, and people were still mocking that, that maybe there is something even bigger. There is certainly other things bigger than that. And I think that we as a community need to have a kind of a different way of talking about veterans who have mental health challenges. That they're not, it's easy to focus on the ones who are committing suicide. It's easy to focus on the ones who are homeless or who are justice involved. But like, what about the strong veteran, like the now Sergeant Major, who saw a therapist, off post, of course, in 2008, and is now, Sergeant Major. What about those? That's what we need to, instead of celebrate the veterans that have the strength. And there's a couple interesting campaigns that are going on about that, from the DoD or the VA. But I think that more needs to be done at a community level, and maybe some of that is individual veterans self-disclosing. Hey, that crazy veteran that you are railing against just trying to get benefits. Well, I've had PTSD since I got back from Kate Song back in '68. And that's a big ask, though.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is while in no way, tooting the old horn here, but veterans who've come on, like Jeff Adamek, who is a highly decorated Green Beret, has come on and talked about his own, experience with mental health. Or David Smith, who is again a decorated Marine Corps, was involved early on with Team Rubicon, who has a great position now as a Bush scholar from the Bush Institute, and he talks about his struggles with moral injury. And so we have these episodes on this podcast where veterans are coming out and they're talking about this. And again, that leads to the, if that guy can talk about it, then I can talk about this. And again, it's happening slowly, 1 pebble, 2 pebble, 3 pebbles, and not necessarily getting it to be the landslide that's really going to make a seismic shift.
Do you think they can get to the point where we do have that landslide? And what would it take?
These stories of it takes 18 years to become an overnight success kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I guess if we step back and we look at it, you and I are seeing veterans who are finally deciding to step in, either, justice involved, not, but even they're told to. Actually, one of the other guests, Dr. Kidd, says to reach out for help. One of 3 things. You're told to do it by one of 3 things: your lawyer, your lover, or your liver. Right? So either the relationship or justice involvement. But we're seeing veterans come in 5 years after Iraq or Afghanistan, compared to 30 years after. And so a shift maybe is starting to come. And veterans are starting to acknowledge this earlier and earlier. And I think, yes, we're going to have a setback, but maybe this is a movement that's going to make a difference. I mean, we're really in this for kind of the long haul.
Yeah, I think that's maybe another thing that's really important to note is that I think I want this problem to be solved overnight. I hope all of us want this, to wake up tomorrow and never hear about another veteran completing suicide. But yeah, let's look at the change in generations. So I have a Korean War veteran who's 88,
Mm-hmm.
that I meet with occasionally, and he didn't start talking about these problems until he retired very late in life, until he was in his early to mid 80s, and he was talking to family members, and they said, "Hey, we'd never heard these stories before." And then a family member knew me and said, "Hey, why don't you talk to Carl?" And that in this message that I get from him, and that he wants everybody to know, is don't wait until you're 80. Don't wait 60 years. And just the fact that, yeah, when he got back, there was nothing. Vietnam veterans got back, there wasn't really much, but within, organically they developed the vet centers. But the fact that we are, as a nation, talking about veterans' mental health issues, and the fact that there are solutions, is going to hopefully push people into care. And within 5 years is better than within 30.
Right, and I think that's really again, why I started this podcast is the conversation is going in that direction. Is that veterans are talking about mental health. I'm an avid podcast listener, and I've had several of the hosts on the show. But veterans were talking about veteran mental health on these non-mental health shows, right? On the veteran transition shows.
Yeah.
And I've heard, John Lee Dumas, and he's not even a veteran he's a veteran who has this huge podcast, but he's come on shows and talked about how challenging his transition was out of the military. And he was, he was purposelessness, and he was lost, and all of this existential stuff that you and I, as mental health professionals, we have in our back pocket. So veterans are talking about this, but they're not talking about it with mental health professionals in the room, and that's where the gap that we, the mental health industry, is coming late to the game. You might not be surprised how many of our colleagues are not on Twitter, talking about mental health. I was actually just talking to somebody today, and out of respect, I'm not gonna, but we were talking about how to use the Twitter, right? What do I do?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things. But if we really have to meet the veteran where they're at, we have to meet them where they're at, and a lot of that's through social media and online, and having these discussions out in the open. But we see a shift. If we look at a shift between legacy VSOs, so to speak, the VFW and the American Legion, and then the new age VSOs like Team Rubicon, Mission Continues, these new nonprofits, Psych Armor, Travis Manion Foundation, the Pat Tillman Foundation, all of these next generation, they've emerged because a need was there, and they're serving a need that the veteran, that a current era veteran is one. So there's an evolution, and yes, I truly do believe that we are at an evolutionary place in which it's going to come in. But in the meantime, we know that there's veterans out there suffering, so we're caught in this place.
Yeah, how do we balance? I mean, you're right. Like, it's let's balance it. And I think that one thing that a lot of these younger non-legacy VSOs, Mission Continues, Team Rubicon, is that they were, in some ways, a lot of them were established as a response to mental health challenges, if not called that. That veterans were saying we need to do something ourselves, and mental health providers really weren't part of that conversation in the earliest stages, but have gotten on board pretty quick.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly it. And that's where my concern, and it's always been, is if mental health professionals like you and I are not at the table when it comes to talking about moral injury and needs fulfillment and purpose and meaning and family systems and emotion, if we're not there, then people who don't have the expertise, the clinical training, are going to talk about it anyway. And that's when we get less than effective interventions for pretty significant mental health concerns.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, these conversations are happening everywhere. But again, it rose by any other name. If they're talking about, if they're, and Team Rubicon and Red, White, and Blue and Mission Continues, they do great things. And how do we get, but again, if the response to depression and suicidal thoughts and PTSD is, let's chainsaw some dead trees in in a wildfire area, that's great for many, many veterans. That's enough for many, many veterans, but there is a huge sizable amount that need the professional assistance.
Right, and I agree, and I am a huge proponent of, again, in who we keep talking about, Team Rubicon, Mission Continue. I think they're doing excellent work, and even Project Sanctuary. You're familiar with them, of course, being here in Colorado. We had James Pond and Veterans Path.
Can I throw a shout out for another group?
Yeah.
All right. So in Baltimore, there's a group called the Sixth Branch, and they've been active since 2009, really, working on community change through service at the local level. I've been, have been involved with them, but yeah, this is happening all over our country.
Right, and so there's these programs, and even if we look at the Wounded Warrior Project, where their Project Odysseys and things like that. And so veterans are having these very meaningful, purposeful events, but then they come back, and now what, right? They're, what is still there to kind of carry on? And so, again, like Project Sanctuary, they do have this follow-up. They don't just come down out of the mountains and then the veteran kind of goes away. But I was struck by, I don't know if you saw back in January, Michael Phelps had come out and talked about his struggle with depression that happened after every single Olympics. And this dude, top of the world, most decorated Olympian.
Yeah, the best.
And he comes back and he no longer has that. There is this cycle, and we see it post-deployment. I was on top of the world. Now what am I? If I retire from swimming, am I going to be, so-and-so? And so, and without that continued care, it can be in a very dangerous place. And that's what can happen with veterans if it's not sustained. Okay, I did great things. I went down to Houston. I went down to Florida. I helped with the hurricane, and now I'm coming back, and I don't know how to sustain that meaning and purpose and regulate my emotions and control my PTSD and things like that. And so that's where the benefit can be working with the mental health professional. Yeah,
it's almost like you're getting another fix, of that rush, of that purpose. But then what? Michael Phelps is not going to be able to, continue to participate in the Olympics the rest of his life. So how does he, adapt to that? Or how does that veteran adapt to the fact that they're never going to be, doing convoy security in Afghanistan again? And I think that's part of it. Is like, you may need a professional to do that, but the professional needs to be in the conversation.
And the fact that you need a professional doesn't mean that you're crazy. And that's the other piece, is the fact that you that a mental health professional has the clinical training and experience, the clinical skills to be able to hold space, right? That's what we do, is we kind of create space in our offices or in our, in our places, that this is a safe place for you to kind of work out some of the understanding and these emotions that a person that is trained to clinically hold space for someone like that, it's a coach, it's a mentor, right? And but it's somebody that has the understanding of the, we learn psychology, we study psychology.
Yeah.
Frankel and Yalom and all of these, choice theory and ACT and all of these different theoretical aspects that someone who's just trying to make a veteran feel better doesn't actually make them be better.
Yeah, it's about that change that's happening, not just the patch. So I think about it. It's like you have a car that's making a sound, right? and you and your buddy Gus can start poking around at the different things and maybe watching some YouTube videos. But it's, you take it to a mechanic. The mechanic knows what he's doing and can help and can fix it.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. But then we're kind of trained to know that there's something here that's out of my scope, right? There's something here that's beyond my capability. When it comes to, and this is an amusing story, that when I was in Iraq, non-combat injury, cranked my ankle pretty bad to the point where, looking at it later, I tore some tendons. But of course, dumb old Sarge doesn't go to the aid station. He goes to his medic, and the medic looks at it and says, "Hey, wrap it up. Here's some Motrin, and here, I'll throw you some crutches." And I was on crutches, and I limped around for a week and a half, and then find out 7 months later, when it doesn't go away, that I had improperly healed ruptured tendons because my dumb butt didn't go to the person who actually had the clinical training to look at my ankle. Like, he was playing Rubik's Cube. He looked at it. And he was like, it's good. Right?
Yeah,
and
I've seen that before. Yeah, just go take some Motrin.
Love you, doc. I mean, it's great. It's the medics are cool, but then there's certain times where it rises above our level of expertise. However, the car is so expensive, or the leaky pipe is so expensive, or this is so critical that I'm going to do that sooner rather than later. But somehow we don't do that with mental health.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, we talk to veterans, who, or even I'll speak from my own experience. I really wish I had dealt with some of these things a long time ago, and the time that I lost is priceless. Like, that's something I think that's important, that emphasizes the time value of money. Like, how much is a year of feeling better worth?
Yeah, and again, I don't know if we've come up with that solution, other than it's that old story about the old man on the beach with the starfish, right? I can't clean up the whole beach, but at least I saved this one. And while, yes, that may keep us going, but that's not ultimately satisfying. We know, you and I know, that there are veterans out there that can benefit from the work that we're doing. And it can be frustrating not being able to do that. And I think that really that's the thing, is just these conversations that we're having, one conversation at a time, archiving these conversations in the podcast, and really just, and spreading it out. And that's the thing, again, that, we're not going to get thousands and thousands of hits on the blogs or the podcasts, because it's still kind of a taboo subject.
Yeah.
But
you're right. I really like I don't know, for me, like, I feel like this conversation's been like a real kind of grounding to, back to what are we really doing right now? And it's still the early stages, and we're helping veterans and families. And at the end of the day, that if one veteran hears this podcast and decides to follow up, or one husband says, "Hey, honey, I heard this podcast. What do you think about getting some help for anger?" Then that's a big difference,
And I think that, and we can, what is it that, faith is things unseen, and we're not going to be able to see a lot of these things come to fruition, perhaps. But, and look at Bessel van der Kolk, and really with PTSD, and how the understanding about veteran mental health has advanced in the last 40 years. And then where is it going to be 10 years from now, and things like that. So it's sort of, and it's a matter of the clinical work that you and I are doing are addressing this in the current time, where we're also addressing the future. And sort of trying to get the word out. So, and it's what you've been doing. Again, you and I have been talking about this. I kind of ribbed you a little bit. I've been wanting you to come on the podcast since the beginning.
Yeah, and I should have. But I think, like we've talked about, is that I think that I've felt this project, this problem, this project, this movement is so huge that, like, what am I really doing to make it better? And you're right. Like, it's like, yeah, I mean, if this conversation had happened 3 years ago, maybe it would have impacted someone then, you know, and I'm glad I got to do it. I think this is exciting. But I think you're right. There is no magic bullet, and it's that slow change is what's going to happen.
Well, it's in its analogy, I think I haven't used in a pretty long time, but it's eating the elephant, right? You know, how do you eat an elephant? You just pick an ear and start chewing, because if you stand back and say, man, there's no way I'm going to eat that elephant, then it's going to stay uneaten. And so, you know, if you pick the left ear and I pick the right ear and somebody else, you know, and if enough of us start to come around, and we have been having some great conversations. You know, we've had Marjorie Morrison from Psych Armor on the show, and Heather Kelly, you know, from the APA, you know, and we've had some national people that are, if we're all having these conversations in our communities, the more conversations we have, the more communities will be reached, and then ultimately the goal of making veteran mental health as common as talking about the weather, we'll get there. Yeah,
you're right. And if we even look at, I mean, so you were in 2003 when I was sleeping 16 hours a day in college. You know, did you hear anybody talk about mental health in relation to soldiers? Maybe less so, or not.
So I think back on that time, and we're going time machine here.
Yeah.
I had just funny backstory. Not that I've ever hidden it, but I was a recruiter. As a matter of fact, you and I have talked about it because I was a recruiter at Fort Meade at the time. But I was a recruiter, and it was right when I was leaving Germany. I wanted to go to the 101st, and since my assignments manager said, "Oh, you want to volunteer for something? Here you go."
Okay. We got you.
But even then, the stress of being a recruiter, and what many people didn't know, and this emerged several years later, is the U.S. Army Recruiting Command had a pretty significantly high suicide rate because of the stress of being a recruiter. But it was something that you just dealt with it. I think somebody told me once, there's 3 things that you get out of recruiting, or 3 things that you find in recruiting: alcoholism, a divorce, or Jesus. You know, and that was sort of the joke, but it was the stress there. Thinking back beyond that, when I was in Germany, and it was always something that was, you know, it was an anomaly. It was that trailer that they stuck you in, right? It was that a purple folder or sticker or the elevator of shame. But it was always this sort of taboo place that was to be avoided, and not something that, it was always the last resort and never the first resort.
Yeah. And the thing is, there were changes in the recruiting command.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not perfect now, but I think it's probably a little bit better.
Yeah, and even to the changes, you know, what you're talking about, this would, you know, and not that there were podcasts back then, but was this conversation actually happening? No. You know, with you know, Jeff Adamek or Dave Smith coming on and coming out openly and saying, these are the struggles I've had, then no, they wouldn't have happened. So hang in there, Carl. You know, our life expectancies are like 80, so maybe we'll see it when we're, you know, 82.
Yeah, if only we'll have some hair left by then.
Yeah, well,
too soon.
Too soon, much too soon. Actually, 10, 15 years too late. Well, hey, I really appreciate you coming on the show, Carl. I know this was a little bit more free-ranging and stuff like that, but I think this is a conversation that's really beneficial.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, this is great, and there's just a lot of great brains in this, and glad to be able to work with you on this.
Yes, and maybe you'll come on and be a friend of the show, and we'll have many more rambling conversations like this. I
hope
great.
So. Yeah. All right. Take care.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV podcast network. If you couldn't tell, Carl and I could talk about this for hours and actually have in the past. If I remember correctly, we had this conversation late on a Friday at the end of a long week for both of us, and yet we were still able to get in some really good points. The challenge that Carl brought out is one that's frustrating for many of us in the mental health field. How do we reach veterans? How do we help them understand that talking to a mental health counselor, a therapist, can actually help make their post-military lives better, to relieve some of the stress and anxiety that gets in our way? In this episode, Carl flips the table on me and puts me on the spot. What can be done to bridge the gaps that exist? Like I said in this episode, it's this right here. Me talking, you listening, and sometimes you talking and me listening. Having a conversation about the realities of mental health, why veterans avoid it, why we don't want to talk about it. If each of us, in our own small way, were to have meaningful discussions about it, then maybe things would change. And things are changing. It's one of the reasons that Eddie and Bennett brought me onto the Change Your POV podcast network, because they both realized that there weren't enough discussions about veteran mental health. That's the whole point of this show, the Headspace and Timing blog, the ebook, the actual book, to have an honest discussion about veteran mental health. Speaking about getting the word out, I'm going to start doing something to support organizations that are looking to spread the word about veteran mental health. It's been just under a month since the release of the last Headspace and Timing book, Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy. I've had a few veteran nonprofits reach out and ask how they could get some copies of the book for their organizations. I've decided to donate a number of free books to many different organizations based on how many have been sold. I'm looking for programs that are interested in participating. Reach out to me at Dwayne@veteranmentalhealth.com to start a discussion about what the program looks like. If you want to help spread the word and get free books in the hands of organizations doing great work, then check it out at veteranmentalhealth.com/combatvetbook. Next week, we're highlighting another great organization supporting veterans in their post-military life, Sentinels of Freedom. You'll really enjoy hearing the great work they're doing for veterans education. Till then, stay focused and be well. I'd like to thank the Change Your POV podcast network for hosting this show and highlighting the critical importance of veteran mental health. We want to hear from you. You can reach out to me via email at Dwayne@veteranmentalhealth.com. You can find me at Twitter @TheCounselingVet, or head on over to Facebook and look for the Change Your POV squad. You can find the show notes for this episode and all the episodes by going to veteranmentalhealth.com or changeyourpov.com. Sign up for updates on either or both so you don't miss another episode. While you're at it, check out the other great shows in the Change Your POV podcast network. The show about remembering our military history and reviving our warrior spirit, changing hearts and minds. The show about outdoor activities that us veterans love so much, Neophyte in the Woods. The show that helps us get going at the beginning of the week, Motivation Monday. And Attack Fridays, the show that brings you actionable tips, tricks, and coachable knowledge to help you make the best of your transition. While you're checking out the other shows, drop us a review in iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're listening to. The reviews really help spread the word about what we're doing. If you're looking for the total package for all the information you need to live the life you want after leaving the military, you found it. If you know of a buddy who's looking for the same info, share it with them so they can find it too. I want to thank Doc Todd for his permission to use his track, Not Alone, from his amazing album, Combat Medicine. Doc Todd is somebody who's trying to bring veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can get the album by going to therealdoctodd.com. Check it out, because remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy, deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision Lasix, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick. Oh, I try so carry on and keep standing. Stand up. How this life so demanding. So much pain on this planet. I hurt each time I wait, but with you I'm not alone. Not alone. You're not alone. Oh, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again. Yeah, just pick up the phone. You're not alone. Just pick up the phone. You're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone. You're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone. I'm right here, and I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man. You've been through enough pain. Stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man. Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.